You've been told sensitivity is your weakness, and for years you leaned into that lie because it kept you safe. But what if everything you were taught to hide is the very engine of your strength? What if healing doesn't strip you of feeling, but hands you control over it? Think back to how you survived. You learned scripts and quick repairs, smooth the mood in a room, mop up someone else's anxiety before it spilled. Say the thing that would stop the argument, stay late because a crisis needed you, agree even when it cost you rest. Those weren't bad choices. They were strategies that worked in a world where being steady got you love, protection, and a place at the table. But surviving is not the same as flourishing. Survival keeps you on guard. Healing changes the operating system. If this is landing with you, give this video a like and stay with me. There's a map here, not a lecture. Before you healed, your day probably felt like a circuit breaker constantly flipping. You absorbed tension like static. You became convenient stability, the person who could be leaned on, the steady anchor in a storm. People-pleasing was less a habit than a currency. You bought calm with your ascent. You clung to familiar chaos because the unknown felt riskier than the predictable drain. You became an expert at invisible labor, smoothing ruffled feathers, parsing half-sentences into meaning, staying awake to other people's emergencies while your own needs waited in the dark. That pattern taught you something essential. You are attuned. The tuning is neither accidental nor defective. It's wiring that can be sharpened into a skill, but left unmanaged, it becomes a vulnerability. You learn to give in order to keep connection. You learn to preempt problems, to avoid rejection. Those moves preserved relationships in the short run and eroded your center in the long run. You were generous with access to your inner life. You assumed everyone who wanted in deserved it. The turning point isn't dramatic fireworks. It often begins with a quiet, stubborn refusal to keep trading yourself away. Maybe it's a single night you spent awake after smoothing another person's crisis and realizing your own crisis had been postponed for years. Maybe it's a tiny collapse, a burnout, a meltdown, an empty feeling that finally made the cost visible. Whatever the trigger, the shift is marked by a simple, seismic realization. Solitude no longer feels like exile. It becomes a sanctuary. Solitude as sanctuary looks less like isolation and more like recalibration. When you heal, being alone turns into a generous refuge where you rebuild your inner boundaries and listen without replicating someone else's storm. You begin to see solitude as a practice room for discernment. In that quiet, you learn to distinguish between your feelings and the feelings you've been carrying for others. You learn to say yes from abundance and no from intactness. As the fear of being alone softens, your standards rise. You don't settle for shallow reassurances or half-hearted respect. Access to your attention, time, and emotional bandwidth becomes conditional, not because you're stingy, but because you're responsible. You choose who sits at your table. You stop chasing people as a strategy for avoiding abandonment. You stop fixing relationships that don't want repair. No longer do you accept access as default. You set entry requirements. Here's a simple entry requirement you can use as a template. 3 qualities someone shows before deeper emotional access is granted. Consistent respect, reciprocal effort, and accountability when they harm you. If someone doesn't demonstrate these, you decline deeper intimacy, knowing that boundaries protect your capacity to love rather than restrict it. That is a moral choice. It preserves your generosity so it isn't exhausted on people who take without giving. Healing also transforms how you read people. What used to feel like an overwhelming spill becomes pattern recognition. You still feel deeply, but now the feeling is a data point, not the whole map. You see recurring dynamics the way a detective spots a handwriting style across letters. You notice gestures, timing, and phrases that repeatedly explain behavior. That doesn't mean you can read minds. It means you collect evidence, calibrate, and respond with clarity instead of reactivity. You become what looks like a human lie detector, not because you reach into someone else's thoughts, but because your attention has been refined to catch small inconsistencies. Gestures that don't match words, apologies that never change behavior, generosity that retracts under inconvenience. Pattern recognition is a tool, not a weapon. The ethical decision you make is crucial. You could weaponize that ability to manipulate and control. But what defines the healed empath is the refusal to do so. You choose integrity. That choice reshapes every room you enter. Manipulators, those who fed on your unguarded availability, will notice and step back. They're uncomfortable when the easy access they relied on is no longer there. That discomfort can look like irritation, pleading, or passive withdrawal. It's not your job to punish them or to persuade them into changing. Witnessing their reaction is information. It tells you who will work to meet you at your standards and who will not. Honest people feel the difference. People who were waiting for someone to hold a mirror up to them, who wanted courage modeled, will find relief around you. Your presence becomes a boundary itself, calm, clear, non-reactive. You start to realign group dynamics simply by being steadier. You won't put out every fire, but you won't be the fuel either. The ripple effect matters, because when you stop subsidizing dysfunction, it forces accountability and gives space for healthier responses. What new capacities actually show up? Here's the inventory you can expect to develop and practice. Quieted reactivity. You still feel deeply, but response replaces reflex. You can pause and choose the form your empathy takes. Validation, limits, or holding space without solving. Selective access. You become a curator of your inner life, granting entry only after you see the basic respect and reciprocity you deserve. Pattern recognition. You read dynamics across time, not just moment to moment, and you respond based on trends rather than one-off crises. Non-extractive presence. You offer your care in ways that nourish both parties. You refuse to be the unpaid emotional workforce. Ethical authority. You wield your perceptive power with restraint, choosing integrity over manipulation, even when the latter would be easier or more immediately rewarding. These are practical, observable shifts. They don't harden your heart. They align it. Your compassion becomes steady, focused, and sustainable because it's no longer a resource drained dry. You'll need tools to embody this identity. Here are accessible non-clinical practices that cultivate the shift without demanding radical upheaval. Solitude ritual, 10-20 minutes. Sit in a quiet space with a notebook. Set a timer for 15 minutes. Minute 1 to 3. Breathe and ground. Name at least 3 sensations in your body. Minute 4 to 8. List what feelings you notice without explaining them. Don't analyze, note. Nodi, minute 9 to 12. Ask one question. Is this mine or borrowed? Trust the first answer that rises. Minute 13 to 15. Decide one small boundary experiment you'll try today, a phrase you'll use or a time limit you'll set, and write it as if it's already true. Use this to center decisions, not to escape. The goal is clarity, not rumination. A practical boundary phrase you can speak without guilt. I care about you, but I can't take that on right now. I can help in this specific way, or we can schedule a time to talk when I can give you my full attention. Short, honest, and firm. It models care while maintaining limits. An entry requirement script to test the waters with someone new. Before we go deeper, it matters to me to know how we handle conflict. Can I share one standard I have and ask if you can meet it consistently? Then name one standard. E.g., I expect that when something goes wrong, we both own our part and try to repair it. These are small practices that shift your economy of attention. They're not manipulative tricks. They are guardrails for generosity. Expect tension. Not everything will be harmonious. When you stop being endlessly available, there will be friction. Some relationships will loosen. That doesn't mean you failed. It's the market correcting. Some people were trading off your generosity, and when the product is no longer on sale, they look elsewhere. That's painful for a bit, but it's also clarifying. You learn who comes with accountability and who leaves with entitlement. Be mindful of the pitfalls. Healing is not a license to dominate. You must avoid two extremes, becoming so guarded that you produce cold detachment, or swinging back into enmeshment because old patterns feel familiar. The healed empath balances fire and sanctuary, controlled heat that warms and does not burn. You become principled, not punitive. There are ethical guardrails to keep in mind when your perceptiveness sharpens. First, recognize that pattern recognition is probabilistic. You notice tendencies. You don't divine motives with absolute certainty. Second, refuse to weaponize insight to coerce or punish. The most radical choice a healed empath can make is to hold their perceptive edge with mercy. Third, refuse to be shamed into invisible labor by those who prefer their old arrangement. Your boundaries are not a moral failing of others. They're a protection for your capacity to care. Why does this transformation matter beyond your private life? Because how you hold yourself changes the ecology around you. When empaths stop fueling toxic systems, those systems either adapt, shift, or collapse. That's not vengeance, it's reallocation of resources to healthier channels. In workplaces, you stop absorbing unfair burdens, and by doing so, either other people learn to step up or the expectations are corrected. In families, modeling boundaries gives permission for others to find their health. In friendships and romantic partnerships, clarity about access and accountability invites more honest intimacy. The healed empath becomes a stabilizing force that's also a catalyst for maturity. People learn to feel their own feelings because they no longer outsource them to you. That's hard for some to accept. They may resist, test, or plead. Hold course. Tests reveal commitment. If someone is not willing to meet your basic standards, it's a sign of mismatch, not moral failure on your part. Here are practical decision lenses you can use in everyday interactions. The time test. If a request would erode your basic needs, sleep, mental bandwidth, financial limits, delay and negotiate terms rather than saying yes reflexively. The reciprocity check. Is the other person investing emotionally or practically at a similar level over time? If not, ask for a recalibration before deeper engagement. The pattern. Pause. Before reacting to a familiar provocation, ask, is this a new issue or a recurring script? Respond to the pattern, not just the moment. These lenses make choices less exhausting. They allow you to be generous without being depleted. You will sometimes grieve what the old role provided: attention, belonging, a sense of being indispensable. That grief is real and deserves tenderness. But grief is different from obligation. Healing honors that sadness while refusing to let it dictate unsafe choices. It lets you mourn the cost of your past while reclaiming the power it gave you when properly stewarded. Remember, healing is iterative. You'll backslide into old habits sometimes because they are well worn. The healed empath doesn't expect perfection, you expect refinement. Each time you notice a slip, you practice the simple corrective. Bring it to your solitude ritual, name the pattern, and try a small boundary phrase the next time. Progress accumulates. There is power in choosing restraint. Many believe power must roar, but your power will be measured in steady thermostats, not fireworks. It's the person who can hold the room's temperature without burning anyone. It's the calm that allows others to see themselves more honestly. That is influence, not control. To be clear, this doesn't make you invincible. You will still be hurt sometimes. The healed empath's advantage is not invulnerability. It's a higher signal-to-noise ratio. You suffer less needless erosion of self. You recover faster because your internal resources are protected. You give out of choice rather than obligation. That matters because it preserves your generosity for the people and causes that truly deserve it. If you want to start today, pick one small experiment. Choose one person and apply the time test when they make an emotionally heavy ask. Delay, name limits, and offer an alternative. Notice how your energy does or does not shift. Journal the outcome for a week using the solitude ritual steps. Small experiments build trust in your new way of being. If you're wondering how to explain this transformation to others, you don't need an elaborate speech. A brief statement of principle works. I'm practicing being more intentional with my time and energy. I'm here for you, but I'm also protecting my capacity to be present. That phrase invites curiosity and sets a boundary without moralizing. What you become matters because it rewrites rules that have been harmful for too long. When empaths learn to steward their sensitivity, systems that relied on invisible labor are forced to ask better questions. Who carries emotional work here? How can we distribute it more fairly? That ripple improves not only your life, but the lives of people in your orbit who are waiting for permission to stop over-functioning or to start owning their contributions. You don't become less compassionate when you heal. You become more capable of real compassion, the kind that sees another's suffering and responds without losing yourself. That is the most radical gift you can offer the world. Hope is not a distant promise. It's already opening inside you. The healed empath emerges not by abandoning empathy, but by aligning it. Your sensitivity becomes a sourced power, regulated by boundaries, expressed through integrity, and used to create real safety. You reclaim the parts of yourself you once handed away because you thought that's the price of being loved. If you want tools to hold these boundaries, start with the 3 practices here. The 15-minute solitude ritual to gain clarity. The entry requirements: respect, reciprocity, accountability, to protect access, and the boundary phrase to refuse draining requests with dignity. Try them in small doses and notice what changes. If this spoke to you and you want a guided walkthrough of more practical phrases and experiments, check the next video in this series or the link in the description for a short downloadable guide. Subscribe so you don't miss the next lesson where we practice these scripts together. You are not called to fix everyone. You are called to steward your sensitivity so it becomes a force for clarity, healing, and sustainable love. That is what a healed empath becomes, and why it matters.